The monastery corridors were no longer places of prayer and reflection. They had been transformed into chambers of unspeakable horror that no one had ever experienced before in the history of that sacred space. Stone walls that once echoed with hymns and chanting, with the voices of monks in devotion singing psalms, now carried something entirely different. A wail of agony so raw, so primal, so utterly inhuman, that even the most hardened monks and trained warriors fled in absolute terror from the sound itself, unable to bear what they were hearing, not from battle, not from siege, not from any external enemy that could be fought with sword or strategy. The source of this unbearable sound was a man who had conquered kingdoms with nothing but iron will and the edges of sharper steel, a man who had reshaped civilizations through force of personality and military genius. He was now being conquered by something he could not see, could not fight, and could not possibly stop, no matter how much of his remaining strength he mustered, or how much he tried to command his own body to obey. The man was William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, King of England, the man who had changed the course of history at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the man whose conquest had created the modern English language and shaped European civilization for centuries to come. And he was rotting alive from the inside out while his heart still beat and his lungs still drew breath, still conscious and aware of every moment. Every system in his body was simultaneously failing him in the most grotesque and horrifying way imaginable. The man who had bent an entire civilization to his will now found that will utterly powerless against biological processes that cared nothing for his rank or his achievements or his place in history. Servants entering his chamber would hold their breath, wrapping cloths soaked in vinegar and rosewater around their faces before even crossing the threshold into that room of horrors, trying every method they knew to protect themselves. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. The stench invaded the lungs regardless of any precaution or preparation they could make, seeping past all defences like water through a broken dam. It penetrated everything. The walls, the fabric, the very air itself seemed contaminated. It was not the smell of disease or old wounds that could be treated with poultices and herbs. It was not the smell of sickness that could be recognised and understood by medieval physicians working from their incomplete knowledge of the human body. It was decay itself, the active, aggressive decomposition of human flesh, while that flesh still drew breath and occupied a living body, a paradox of nature that seemed impossible yet was happening before their eyes. The living rot, the impossible horror of putrefaction occurring not in a corpse lying in a grave, but in a man still living and aware, still conscious of what was happening to him, when the few remaining attendants asked what pain he endured, what agony consumed him. William could only point to his grotesquely swollen abdomen, blackened in patches with the advancing corruption of gangrenous tissue eating away at him from within like an invisible army, and say nothing, his voice too weak or perhaps the pain too overwhelming to articulate. Words did not exist for what was happening inside his body. Medieval physicians had no framework for understanding it, because it violated all their theories of medicine and disease. Priests had no prayers powerful enough to stop it, because no prayer had ever needed to address such a specific horror before in the entire history of the Church. This is the story of the man who changed the course of history, not how he conquered England at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, with his carefully arranged infantry and cavalry formations deployed across the fields of Sussex in one of medieval Europe's most decisive military engagements that would echo through centuries of warfare. Not how he defeated the Saxon king Harold Godwinson with tactics that would reshape medieval warfare forever, influencing military strategy for centuries to come across the entire continent and beyond. Not how he systematized the subjugation of an entire island nation, introducing Norman feudalism to England, commissioning the Domesday Book that catalogued his new realm with unprecedented detail and precision, constructing castles throughout the land that would stand for centuries as monuments to his rule and power and conquest. Not how he reshaped an entire civilization, changing its language, mixing French with Anglo-Saxon to create a new English that would evolve into modern English, its culture, its very identity and social structure, in ways that persist to this day in our language and society and way of thinking. This is about how he ended, rotting alive in a monastery in Rouen, abandoned by those who served him, robbed by those who revered him, and finally reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale written in the putrid language of his own decay, told and retold through the centuries as a monument to human vulnerability and the ultimate powerlessness of earthly power in the face of biological necessity and the unstoppable forces of nature. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach people across the world, from what countries and what circumstances people find themselves in when they discover tales like this. Now, let's descend together into one of history's most horrifying deaths, a story so grotesque and disturbing that medieval chroniclers felt compelled to document every putrid and obscene detail for posterity. It started with mockery and an insult that would echo through the ages and define the final chapter of a king's life. The kind of insult that cracks the mask of power and exposes the ego underneath, in the most humiliating way imaginable, cutting deeper than any sword could. King Philip of France, sitting in his court surrounded by advisers and nobles, who hung on his every word and gesture, had made an observation about William that spread like plague through every castle from Normandy to England, travelling faster than any messenger could ride. He compared the aging conqueror to a pregnant woman, heavy with child, slow and ungainly and weak. The words were designed to sting precisely because they contained uncomfortable truth that William could not deny or defend against. For a man who had spent his entire life projecting invulnerability, physical power, masculine domination, and absolute control, there was no insult more devastating than to be compared to feminine weakness, to a woman, to someone carrying the burden and weight of impending childbirth. The comparison was meant to suggest that William had become soft, weak, incapable, and no longer fit to rule, that his power was fading with his body. The words devastated William in ways that no battlefield loss could have, cutting through his confidence with surgical precision. He was 59 years old. By medieval standards, he was ancient, almost impossibly old for a man in that era. He had ruled through violence and conquest for most of his life, and violence had kept him young in spirit if not in body, maintaining the psychology of a warrior even as his physical form aged. But his girth had expanded relentlessly with his years, growing with each passing season and each feast and each celebration. The man who once wore armour like a second skin now struggled to fit into it, his body expanding beyond the dimensions the armour was made for. His face, once sharp and commanding, had become florid and round from years of rich food and wine and the luxuries of kingship that had become his standard fare. The belly that had once been muscular had become soft and protuberant, a physical manifestation of aging that no amount of wealth or titles could conceal or make acceptable to a society that still valued physical prowess above all else. And Philip had noticed. More importantly, he had made it public knowledge that everyone could discuss and laugh about. Every noble in France knew about the comparison. Every soldier knew. Everyone knew that William was being mocked by his rival, that his power was being questioned through ridicule. The insult spread from court to court like a disease, infecting the reputation that had taken a lifetime to build through conquest and subjugation. Pride doesn't age gracefully, especially when it has been fed by decades of unchallenged conquest and absolute authority over others. William had built his entire identity on being unconquerable, unshakable, the man against whom no one could stand and survive, the warrior who had never been defeated by an external enemy. He had earned his epithet through battles won, territories seized, and enemies destroyed or humiliated before his feet. To be mocked now was an assault on his very identity and the foundation of his power, an attack on the image he had so carefully constructed. He could not accept it. More importantly, he could not allow others to think he had accepted it, that mockery could touch him. His power, real or illusory, depended on the perception of invulnerability and strength. In the summer of 1087, William made his choice, a choice driven by pride and rage rather than reason or strategic thinking. He would respond to Philip's mockery with fire and destruction, answering insult with the language of warfare. He gathered his forces and moved toward Mantes, deep in French territory, a town that would pay the price for the king's wounded pride. Not a strategic necessity that would benefit his realm. Pure rage transformed into military action. This would be a message written in ash and screams. Fire would prove what words could not. His armies surrounded Mantes with the precision and military proficiency that came from decades of siege warfare across Europe. decades of experience in how to break cities and subjugate populations, the town was put to torch with all the brutal methodology the Normans had perfected to an art form through countless campaigns and conquests. Buildings erupted in flames simultaneously across the town in a coordinated display of destruction and power, timed perfectly to maximize the terror and devastation. Smoke twisted into the summer sky like the souls of the dying, ascending in the wrong direction, rising endlessly upward. Screams filled the air constantly, screams of terror, screams of pain, screams of people trapped in burning structures with no way out, no escape, knowing they would die in the flames. William rode through the burning streets on his warhorse, armoured and magnificent, watching his will be executed in real time with perfect precision, every command obeyed instantly by his soldiers. For a man who had spent a lifetime bending reality to his desires, this was as close to godhood as mortal men could touch, this power over life and death, this ability to command destruction. He could destroy at will. He could command cities to burn at his pleasure. This was power. This was conquest. This was proof that he was not weak, that he was still formidable and dangerous. Then the horse reared suddenly, violently, without any warning or opportunity to prepare. Historians have argued for centuries about what exactly happened next, debating the details like theologians arguing over doctrine. Was it burning embers falling from a collapsing building onto the animal's legs, startling it? Was the animal startled by sudden collapse of a structure nearby, the noise and shock overwhelming its training? Was there another rider who spooked the destrier, or debris that struck the horse? No one could say with certainty, and the ambiguity only added to the sense that fate had intervened. But the result was undeniable and catastrophic. The horse lurched forward violently with tremendous force beyond William's control. William's massive body was thrown hard against the iron pommel of his saddle, the metal horn that served to help a rider maintain his seat during combat. The metal horn drove into his swollen abdomen with devastating force that tore something fundamental, something that should not be torn, something that would set in motion a chain of events no one could stop. It was not a glancing blow that might have bruised him and been forgotten. It was direct impact with all the power and force of the horse's movement, and William's considerable weight combined. William felt something give way inside him, felt it tear and rupture. Something ruptured internally with a sensation of catastrophic failure that he understood immediately meant something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The chroniclers described it simply: William felt something rupture. Fate had intervened in the most unexpected way, turning a moment of triumph into the beginning of a nightmare. The pain was immediate and excruciating beyond any pain he had ever experienced in battle or siege, beyond anything he had endured in his entire life. Not the pain of a surface wound that would bleed and heal. Not the pain of a broken bone that could be set and splintered. It was the pain of something catastrophically wrong happening inside his body, something internal and invisible, something that no physician of the age could possibly repair or even fully understand. Internal injuries in the medieval world were death sentences written in fate and sealed by biology and the unstoppable progress of infection. The physicians had no way to see inside the body, no technology to look at what was happening. They had no way to repair what had torn, no surgery that could fix internal organs. They had no way to stop what was about to happen, no antibiotics that would destroy the invading bacteria, no medical intervention that would change the outcome. His fate was sealed in that moment, locked in by physics and biology. The man had no idea, as he slumped in his saddle gasping for air, struggling to breathe through the pain, that he had just set in motion a chain of events that would result in his becoming a cautionary tale for centuries to come, discussed and analysed by historians across the globe for over 900 years, a story that would endure longer than most of his political achievements. He was carried back to Rouen in a litter, each movement sending waves of agony through his body, each step of the men carrying the litter causing new suffering. Every bump in the road, every stumble or shift in position, caused him to scream out in pain, unable to maintain any dignity or composure. His servants watched their king, the man who had conquered England, who had reshaped civilizations, writhe in agony on a stretcher like a broken man, like someone who was already dying. Once at the Priory of Saint-Sever, he was placed in a chamber meant for honoured guests, but it had become a chamber of suffering and gradually a death chamber. He attempted rest, seeking relief through sleep, but the pain only worsened with each passing hour as his body's natural processes began to go catastrophically wrong. By the second day, something darker was becoming apparent to anyone who looked at him. His abdomen was beginning to swell, visibly enlarging as fluids accumulated inside his body. The swelling increased hour by hour, then day by day with relentless progression. It became apparent that something catastrophic was occurring inside his body, something that was beyond the comprehension of medieval medicine, something that was literally killing him from the inside out. Within days, the true nature of his condition became horrifyingly apparent to anyone with eyes to see and a stomach strong enough to observe it. The internal rupture had breached something fundamental to human survival and function. The barrier between his organs and his abdominal cavity had been shattered by the force of the impact, broken like a wall breached in siege warfare. Intestinal bacteria, normally contained safely within the digestive tract where they belonged, had spilled into spaces they should never reach, spreading throughout his abdomen like invaders spreading through a conquered land. These were not exotic pathogens brought from distant lands. They were the normal flora of the human digestive system, the bacteria that lived peacefully in the gut, and they were going to kill him with mathematical certainty, with the inevitability of a law of nature. Peritonitis began its silent, inexorable work, spreading like an invisible plague through his body. Infection spread through the abdominal lining with the logic of an advancing army conquering territory, unstoppable and relentless. His body was at war with itself, and it was a war it could not win. William's physicians administered every treatment known to medieval medicine, drawing on centuries of accumulated medical theory and practice that was fundamentally flawed. They bled him, believing the excess of blood was causing the problem, draining away vital fluid from his weakening body. They applied poultices made from herbs of questionable efficacy, hoping that something would help. They prayed, calling on every saint and holy figure they could think of. They had nothing else, no other options to explore. Their knowledge was incomplete and based on incorrect theories. Their understanding of infection was theoretical at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, an invisible assailant that was killing their king. They had no weapons that had any power against it. The microscope would not be invented for centuries. The germ theory of disease would not be established until the 19th century. Bacteria were unknown to them, invisible and incomprehensible. They were attempting to treat an infection with medieval remedies that had no effect on modern bacterial pathogens, using methods that had never worked and never would. But as the infection spread throughout his body like an invading army conquering territory, it found no resistance to something more grotesque occurred than anyone had anticipated or could have imagined. Gas gangrenous bacteria began reproducing within his tissues, producing gases as they fed on dying flesh, creating a secondary horror layered on top of the primary infection. William's abdomen swelled to an enormous size, the skin stretching like a drum about to split from the internal pressure, the distension becoming obscene and inhuman. Then the discoloration began, the physical manifestation of death spreading through his body. Red became purple as the tissues died, and blood flow was compromised. Purple became black as death spread through his organs, as living tissue transformed into dead necrotic flesh. Patches of his flesh were dying, rotting while still attached to his living body, a contradiction that nature was nonetheless forcing him to experience. Wet gangrene set in where tissue died and decayed due to infection and compromised blood flow, the tissue literally rotting while he remained alive. His own body was consuming itself, feeding on its own flesh. He remained conscious for much of this transformation, aware and suffering. He could feel it happening. He could see it happening. He could smell it happening. The man who had once been the most powerful person in his world was now helpless before the assault of microscopic enemies he could never fight. The smell came next, not gradually over hours with increasing intensity, but all at once, as if someone had opened a door to hell itself. The monastery had been transformed into a tomb by the stench of death and decay. Servants who entered his chamber began to gag within seconds, unable to tolerate the air itself. The reek of putrefaction was overwhelming, a physical presence that clung to hair and clothing and skin, impossible to remove. One by one, they tried to maintain their duties, tried to continue serving their dying king. One by one, they fled the chamber and the priory, unable to bear it any longer. Even the most loyal found that loyalty had limits when measured in the stench of active decay emanating from a man still drawing breath. The smell became a barrier that even devotion could not penetrate, a wall of pure revulsion that separated the living from the dying. It was as if death itself had taken up residence in the monastery, claiming the space around William as its domain. William's screams could be heard throughout the monastery at all hours, day and night, a constant reminder of what was happening in that chamber. The pain was not the clean pain of a wound that you could see and understand. It was the agony of a body actively consuming itself from within, a pain without external cause that was therefore harder to comprehend. Nerve endings throughout his abdomen screamed as infection destroyed tissue, sending signals of pure anguish to his brain. Medieval chroniclers, accustomed to documenting violence and suffering and brutality across centuries of warfare, found themselves struggling to describe what they witnessed, finding the language inadequate to the horror. This was something uniquely horrible and unprecedented. This was a king of enormous power and achievement reduced to a creature of suffering, his body betraying him in the most fundamental way possible. In his lucid moments, William confronted something far worse than physical pain, something that attacked his mind as much as his body. A man who had solved every problem through force of will and military strength was now powerless and helpless. He could not fight an enemy he could not see, bacteria invisible to medieval eyes. He could not negotiate with bacteria that operated on biological imperatives. He could not command his own body to obey him and stop the processes happening inside. The armor of his accomplishments, his power, his lifetime of achievements, all proved useless against something invisible and relentless. Then came the betrayal, the social horror layered on top of the physical horror that was already consuming him. As William lay dying, as his body rotted away inside the priory, people began to steal. Gold chains disappeared from tables. Jeweled daggers vanished from their sheaths. Fine clothes were taken from chests. Precious artifacts were spirited away. All began to disappear piece by piece, item by item, as if his possessions could escape while he could not. His servants, guards, even nobles who had come to pay respects to their dying king, all found that their loyalty was weaker than their attraction to his wealth and accumulated treasures. William was aware of it. In his moments of consciousness between waves of pain, he could see figures moving through the room like vultures, taking his things, but he was too weak to stop them or even protest effectively. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis recorded with shock and horror how men who had once knelt in reverence before William now stepped over his rotting body to reach his treasures, how they treated the king as an obstacle between them and wealth. Some reportedly laughed as they divided the spoils among themselves, joking about the great conqueror's helplessness. The irony was devastating and complete. The man who had ruled through fear was now a victim of theft and contempt, robbed while dying. Throughout the ordeal, despite the pain and the abandonment, William sought spiritual comfort and redemption. Despite his reputation for brutality and the thousands he had ordered killed, he had always been devout, maintaining faith in God and the Church. Now, facing death, he confessed his sins to priests who came to visit him. He admitted to the deaths of countless thousands throughout his reign. He acknowledged the harrying of the north, a campaign of systematic destruction in 1069 that had devastated an entire region. For months, Norman soldiers had burned crops, slaughtered livestock, destroyed farming implements, and everything that could sustain life. The resulting famine killed an estimated 100,000 people through starvation and exposure. It was ethnic cleansing by another name, and William knew it, had ordered it, had believed it was necessary for his rule. William knew it. The priests who heard his confessions struggled with their own reactions to what they were hearing and witnessing. They were supposed to provide comfort to the dying, to offer absolution and spiritual guidance, but they could barely remain in the chamber long enough to administer last rites and hear his final confession. They would rush through prayers, their words tumbling over each other in haste, bless William hastily, their hands raised quickly and withdrawn, and retreat from the chamber, gasping for fresh air as if escaping a tomb. Even divine mercy seemed to have limits when confronted with the physical reality of William's decay and the stench that filled the space. As July turned to August and the weeks passed, William's body continued its grotesque transformation into something barely recognizable as human. The swelling in his abdomen grew worse with each passing day, stretching the skin until it appeared translucent and paper-thin in places, as if it might tear of its own accord. The blackened patches of dead tissue expanded across his body like continents spreading on a map, occupying more territory with each day that passed. The smell intensified until people in the monastery's courtyard, far removed from his chamber, reported detecting it from a distance, the stench travelling through the air and contaminating the entire building. It hung in the air like a physical presence, like a fog of death that no amount of incense could dispel. Birds reportedly avoided flying over that section of the building, as if some primal instinct warned them away from the concentration of decay. Dogs would not approach the corridor where his chamber lay, whining and backing away from the threshold. The air itself seemed poisoned by the concentration of decay and death, corrupted by the proximity to dying flesh. On September 9th, 1087, William died. After weeks of suffering and agony that seemed endless, the ordeal finally ended. He passed at dawn as cathedral bells rang for morning prayers, the bells tolling to call the monks to prayer, as they had done countless times before. The sound apparently stirred him to consciousness one final time, pulling him back from whatever place his mind had retreated to. He raised his trembling hands in prayer, attempting a final act of devotion, and then was gone, released from his suffering. After weeks of agony, after his body had been consumed by infection and rot, after tissues had died, and gases had built up to unbearable pressure inside his abdomen, death came almost, peacefully, a release and relief. It was the only mercy granted to William in his final days, the only gift that fate or God offered. But the horror was far from finished, far from concluded. In many ways it was just beginning, entering a new phase. The moment his body went cold, the remaining servants fled the chamber and the priory itself. They abandoned the king's corpse where it lay, surrounded by possessions that hadn't yet been stolen or taken away. The problem facing those responsible for William's funeral was unprecedented in the annals of royal death and burial practice. William was a king who demanded a royal funeral with all the ceremony and dignity befitting his station and his achievements. But that body was so decomposed that they did not know how to proceed, had no protocol for dealing with such a situation. The embalmers who were summoned took one look at the corpse and refused immediately, without discussion or negotiation. Traditional embalming procedures were impossible and would not work on a body in this condition. The flesh was already beginning to separate from bone in places, disintegrating before their eyes. They simply refused the task. No amount of payment would convince them or overcome their disgust. Eventually, a local knight named Herlain agreed to organize the funeral arrangements in exchange for payment. It was a task no one else would accept, no other man willing to undertake it. The body was roughly prepared and placed in a lead-lined coffin, meant to contain the smell and the decay. But the process was nightmarish beyond description. Those who had to touch the corpse reported that the flesh was soft and yielding like jelly, that pieces came away in their hands when they tried to move it or dress it. The body was wrapped in layers of cloth soaked in wine and spices in a desperate attempt to mask the odour. Nothing could truly contain the stench or the horror of what they were handling. What was supposed to be a solemn funeral procession became a race against decomposition itself, a desperate attempt to move the body to its final resting place before further deterioration made the situation even worse. The coffin was loaded onto a wagon and covered with cloth and ornaments, but the smell leaked out immediately through any gap or opening it could find. As the procession moved through the countryside, peasants and townspeople who had gathered to pay respects found themselves gagging and fleeing in horror and disgust. Some chroniclers recorded that people threw flowers toward the procession as it passed, not as a sign of respect and honour, but in a futile attempt to counter the overwhelming and unbearable odour that preceded the coffin. Dogs that approached the funeral wagon would howl and run away, disturbed by something their animal instincts recognized as profoundly unnatural and wrong, as a violation of the natural order. When the procession reached Caen, a fire broke out in the town in an unfortunate and untimely coincidence, possibly accidental, possibly the result of the chaos and disorder surrounding the funeral and the gathering of so many people, but it delayed the burial for additional hours while the fire was extinguished and the threat to the town was neutralized. The coffin remained in the summer heat for these additional hours while firefighting efforts consumed everyone's attention. Inside the sealed lead container, the processes of decomposition accelerated dramatically without any relief or slowing. Gases built up within the bloated corpse, produced by the continuing bacterial breakdown of tissue. The pressure inside the coffin increased until it was dangerous, like a bomb of putrefaction waiting to explode, accumulating force with each passing hour. By the time the funeral procession could finally reach the Abbey church, the situation had become critical, dangerous, and about to become catastrophic in ways no one had anticipated. The church of Saint-Étienne in Caen was crowded with nobles, bishops, priests, and clergy who had gathered to honour their deceased king and witness his burial. Despite the rumours about the condition of the body that had been spreading, protocol and social obligation demanded their presence. They had travelled from across Normandy and England. Important men had made the journey. They had arrived expecting a proper royal funeral that would honour the greatest king of their age. The church was decorated with appropriate solemnity and respect. Candles were lit throughout the space in honour of the deceased. Priests in vestments stood ready at the altar. Prayers had been carefully prepared and rehearsed. The stone sarcophagus that would hold William's body sat open and waiting before the altar, positioned to receive the remains of the man who had shaped the entire direction of English history. Everything was arranged for a dignified royal funeral befitting his station. Everything was prepared according to protocol. Everything was wrong. But dignity was about to become impossible and was about to be shattered. The pallbearers carried the heavy lead coffin into the church and began to approach the sarcophagus with slow, ceremonial steps. Immediately a terrible smell began to seep from the coffin, despite all precautions that had been taken. Despite the lead lining meant to contain it completely, the odour was escaping through invisible gaps and openings, filling the sacred space. The seal was not perfect, could not be perfect. The gases and the fluids were finding ways out, leaking into the air. As the coffin was carried down the aisle toward the altar, past rows of assembled dignitaries and clergy, members of the congregation began to cough and cover their faces with their hands, trying to shield themselves. Some of the assembled nobles and clergy backed away, creating space around the coffin as if it carried plague and contagion. But the ceremony had to continue according to protocol, no matter what was happening. The coffin was placed beside the sarcophagus, and the priests began the funeral rites, speaking words of comfort and remembrance while breathing through their mouths, trying desperately to avoid the smell that now filled the entire sacred space. They rushed through prayers with unseemly haste. They wanted this finished. Everyone wanted this finished as quickly as possible. Then came the moment when William's body needed to be transferred from the coffin to the sarcophagus for final burial and entombment. This was the critical moment. This was the point where everything would change and collapse. The pallbearers positioned themselves to open the lead coffin and remove the corpse. They moved carefully, aware of the smell, aware that something was very wrong. The first pallbearer reached for the lid of the coffin, preparing to lift it open. The lead coffin was opened. The moment the seal was broken and the lid lifted, the smell that had been partially contained was suddenly released in full force into the enclosed space of the church, concentrated and overwhelming. The reaction was immediate and violent beyond anything anyone had prepared for or anticipated. People throughout the congregation began to retch, their bodies rebelling against what their noses detected. Some vomited openly, the contents of their stomachs hitting the floor of the sacred church, desecrating the holy space. Others fled toward the doors, unable to maintain any composure or dignity. The pallbearers, committed to completing their task, attempted to lift the corpse, trying to move it from the coffin to the sarcophagus. This was the moment that would define the entire legacy of William's death and burial forever. This is when the ultimate horror occurred, the moment that no one could have predicted or prepared for. William's body, swollen with the gases of decomposition accumulated over weeks, wrapped in cloths and armour, had to be manoeuvred into a stone sarcophagus that had been prepared years earlier based on measurements taken when William was younger and had not yet become so obese. The sarcophagus had been sized when William was younger and more mobile, before his girth had become legendary in its own right, before his obesity had reached the level it had in his final years and months. The bloating caused by decomposition had made his body even larger than it had been in life, swollen beyond its natural dimensions. When the pallbearers tried to force the corpse into the stone coffin, it simply didn't fit, would not slide into the opening no matter how they angled it. The body was too large. The sarcophagus was too small. There was no way to make the two compatible. They pushed harder with increasing desperation. They applied more pressure, more force. They tried to compress the body into a space it could not possibly occupy, tried to make the body conform to the dimensions of the sarcophagus. The swollen abdomen pressed against the sides of the sarcophagus, resisting the pressure. The limbs were folded awkwardly and uncomfortably. More pressure was applied by increasingly panicked pallbearers. The pallbearers were sweating, gagging, desperate to complete the task and escape the smell that surrounded them. And then, to the absolute horror of everyone present, to the shock of the assembled congregation and clergy and nobles, William's body burst, erupted, split open like an overripe fruit. The abdomen ruptured, possibly where it had been injured at Mont all those weeks ago, and the contents of the decomposed corpse erupted outward in a shower of putrefied matter, releasing everything that had been building up inside his body. The smell that had been bad before became absolutely unbearable, transcendent in its awfulness, something that pushed the human senses past their limits. Chroniclers wrote that it was like the gates of hell had opened, that damnation itself had been released into the church. They were not exaggerating for effect. Orderic Vitalis, describing the scene years later from accounts he'd gathered, wrote that the stench was so powerful it was almost visible, like a dark cloud filling the church, like something tangible and malevolent entering the sacred space. Nobles and bishops fled in panic, pushing past each other to reach the doors, desperate to escape. Many were openly vomiting, unable to control their bodies' reactions. Priests abandoned the ceremony mid-prayer, running from the altar as if pursued by demons. The carefully planned, meticulously prepared royal funeral descended into pure chaos and disgrace. Even the most duty-bound attendants could not remain in the building, could not force themselves to stay in that atmosphere. Within minutes the church was nearly empty, abandoned by nearly everyone. Only a handful of clergy remained at a distance, their faces covered with their vestments, unable to look directly at what was happening. Those who remained attempted to salvage what remained of the situation, to impose some order on the chaos. Incense was brought in, massive quantities of it, more incense than had probably ever been burned in that church, and set burning throughout the space in a desperate attempt to overpower the smell. Perfumes were sprinkled everywhere. The body was hastily shoved into the sarcophagus, though it still did not fit properly, protruding and twisted in an undignified manner. It was decided to seal the tomb immediately, permanently, rather than attempt any further ceremony or ritual. Stonemasons were called urgently to seal the sarcophagus with mortar and stone slabs, sealing William away from sight. Even these workers, accustomed to handling the dead and the ordinary processes of burial and tomb construction, had to work in shifts, retreating regularly to breathe fresh air before returning to their task. The ceremony was concluded in unseemly haste, rushed and incomplete. Prayers were mumbled rapidly by priests standing as far from the tomb as possible, their voices barely audible above the sound of the stonemasons working to seal it shut. No eulogies were delivered. No elaborate ceremony celebrated William's achievements and legacy. No grand speech commemorated his reign or his impact on history and civilization. The man who had conquered England, who had defeated Harold at Hastings in 1066, who had ruled 2 kingdoms, who had been one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, was buried in chaos and disgrace. His funeral was remembered not for honouring his legacy, not for celebrating his achievements, but for the revolting spectacle of his bursting corpse, for the horror and degradation visited upon him in death. News of the horrific funeral spread rapidly throughout Norman and English territories like wildfire, passed from person to person in shocked whispers and horrified retellings. The story was too grotesque, too shocking, too perfectly horrible not to share. Within weeks, everyone from nobles to peasants had heard how the great conqueror's body had exploded in church, how the assembled nobles had fled vomiting in disgust, how the burial had been conducted in panicked haste and indignity. For a society that placed enormous importance on proper funeral rites and the dignity of the dead, William's end was seen as particularly shameful and degrading. It was not just a death, it was a judgment. Medieval people believed strongly in divine judgment and divine signs and omens. Many interpreted William's gruesome death and catastrophic burial as God's verdict on his life and his reign. He had lived by violence, conquering and subduing through brutality and force. He had ordered the deaths of thousands, destroyed entire communities, and ruled through fear and intimidation. Now in death, he had been denied even basic dignity, even the fundamental respect owed to the dead. His body had betrayed him, falling apart before witnesses in the most public and horrifying way possible, before the entire assembled clergy and nobility. To medieval observers, this was clearly divine punishment for his sins, a statement from God about the cost of living by the sword. Religious commentators seized on William's end as a lesson about pride and sin and the wages of unrepentant brutality. Sermons were preached using his death as an example of how even the mightiest must humble themselves before God and accept judgment. The harrying of the North was specifically mentioned as a sin so great that even William's pious donations to churches and monasteries could not atone for it or purchase forgiveness. His violent suppression of English resistance, his ruthless treatment of rebels, his iron rule over conquered populations, all were cited as reasons why God had allowed such a degrading death to visit William at the end of his life. Whether or not this interpretation was fair or accurate, it stuck, it endured, it became the accepted narrative. William's rotting death became part of his legend as much as his victories on the battlefield. The practical aftermath was also significant and far-reaching. The unsightly nature of William's burial created problems for his successors. His second son, William Rufus, who inherited England and began his own reign, was reportedly disgusted by the accounts of his father's funeral and wanted nothing to do with the implications or the story. The tomb itself never became a proper shrine or site of veneration that attracted pilgrims. There was something too unsettling about William's burial for it to inspire devotion or religious reverence. The story of the bursting corpse was too well known, too horrifying, too disrespectful. Over the centuries, William's tomb suffered various indignities that seemed to echo his burial itself, as if history itself was continuing his degradation beyond death. In 1562, during the French Wars of Religion, when Catholic and Calvinist forces fought across France, Calvinist troops ransacked the abbey and completely destroyed William's tomb in an act of religious violence. The bones were scattered, lost, or destroyed in the chaos and violence. Only a single thigh bone was reportedly saved by a local monk who took pity on the old king's remains. When the abbey was later restored and rebuilt, a new monument was erected in the 19th century, but it contained only that one bone placed in a new coffin. Thus, the Conqueror's final resting place is ironically almost empty, just as his reputation was emptied by the spectacle of his death. The man who claimed so much territory, who planted his banner over England and held it through force of arms for decades, who expanded his domain across the Channel, has less than a complete skeleton to mark his grave. The irony is profound and deeply meaningful in ways that would have resonated with medieval observers and resonates with modern audiences as well. The Conqueror's final resting place is almost empty. The man who claimed so much territory during his lifetime, who planted his banner over England and held it through force of arms for decades, who expanded his domain across the Channel and reshaped an entire civilization, has less than a complete skeleton to mark his grave. His physical legacy is as fragmented as his rotted body was in death. What remains of William the Conqueror is symbolic in its incompleteness, in its fragmentation, in its ultimate emptiness and insignificance. The medical reality of William's death is now better understood through modern medical knowledge than it was in the 11th century. The injury from the saddle pommel almost certainly ruptured his intestines and possibly damaged his spleen or liver as well. This would have caused internal bleeding initially, which alone could have been fatal, but more importantly it would have released bacteria that normally live safely within the digestive tract directly into his abdominal cavity, where they should never be. Peritonitis, an infection of the abdominal lining, would have developed rapidly, in an age without antibiotics, without modern surgical intervention, without the basic tools of modern medicine. The infection would have caused the characteristic swelling, as fluids accumulated in his abdominal cavity, and tissues became inflamed in response to the infection. His immune system would have mobilized to fight the infection, but it would have been a losing battle from the very beginning, overwhelmed by the bacterial invasion. The gangrenous deterioration that chroniclers described would have been both gas gangrene, caused by bacteria producing gases within the tissues, and wet gangrene, where tissue dies and decays due to infection and compromised blood flow. The combination would have been agonizing and absolutely unstoppable by any treatment available in 1087. The smell would have been produced by the bacterial breakdown of tissue, releasing compounds like putrescine and cadaverine, which are responsible for the characteristic stench of decomposition. William's size worked against him in multiple ways. His obesity, which had been increasing in his later years and was the subject of Philip's mockery, meant more tissue to become infected, more surface area for the infection to spread across and consume. It also meant worse circulation in his extremities and throughout his body, allowing gangrene to spread more easily through tissues that were already compromised by age. The large amount of abdominal fat would have provided an excellent environment for bacterial growth and proliferation. When he died, the gases produced by bacterial action inside his corpse would have built up under pressure, especially in the heat of late summer. The rupturing of his abdomen during the funeral was almost inevitable given these conditions, a natural consequence rather than a surprise. Modern medicine would have saved William with relative ease. Antibiotics would have stopped the infection dead in its tracks before it could spread. Surgery could have repaired any internal injuries and cleaned out infected tissue. Even the immediate aftermath of the injury, if treated quickly in a hospital with modern facilities and antibiotics, would likely have been survivable. He would have been uncomfortable. He might have required significant surgery and a long recovery. But he would have lived to see another day, another season, another year. But in 1087, internal injuries were death sentences written in Latin and sealed by biology. The most skilled physicians of the age could do nothing but watch William die, utterly powerless, unable even to ease his pain significantly with the medications available to them. The psychological impact of such a death cannot be overstated or diminished or minimized in any way. To rot while still alive, to feel one's own body decomposing from the inside, to smell the stench of your own decay while consciousness remains. This is a horror beyond imagination, beyond what most people could comprehend or even contemplate. For a man, like William, whose life had been defined by physical prowess, control, and domination over others, the experience must have been psychologically devastating beyond measure. He was forced to confront not just his mortality, but his absolute helplessness before biological processes he could not control. His body became his enemy in a way no external foe had ever been, in a way no enemy he had ever defeated could have been. There is something universally terrifying about the idea of one's body betraying one from within, from inside, with no external threat visible. We can fight external enemies, can organize strategies against them, can rally forces against them and hope to defeat them. But when our own flesh becomes the problem, when our own body turns against us, there is nowhere to turn. We cannot negotiate with our own selves, we cannot defeat them in combat, we cannot flee from them. William's death tapped into a primal fear that resonates across centuries and cultures, across every human understanding of vulnerability and mortality. It is why the story has endured, retold by chroniclers and historians, studied by scholars, reaching modern audiences through books and documentaries and now through this script, still reaching listeners and still fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. It is why we still tell the story of how William the Conqueror died, 938 years after that terrible summer in Rouen. We still recoil at the details, still feel something of the shock that witnesses must have experienced when they saw his body burst before the assembled congregation. The story has survived because it touches on fundamental truths about power, mortality, and human nature. It reminds us that beneath all our achievements and status, we are fragile creatures of flesh and blood, subject to forces we cannot fully control or predict or prevent. William the Conqueror reshaped England and changed the course of history forever. The Domesday Book, the castles, the Norman aristocracy, the changes to the English language, all these legacies endure and continue to shape the world we live in. But alongside these monuments to his power stands the story of his death, a monument to his mortality. Perhaps it is important that we remember not just what William achieved, but how he ended. Rotting alive in a monastery, abandoned and betrayed, his body bursting at his funeral before a fleeing congregation unable to maintain their composure. This is the full measure of the man, both his triumphs and his degradation, both his power and his vulnerability. The conqueror in the end was conquered by the one enemy no one can defeat, death itself, made all the more terrible by arriving slowly, painfully and publicly, reducing a king to a rotting corpse that could not even be buried without causing horror. And perhaps In that truth lies a lesson we all must learn about the nature of power and the ultimate equality of death.